The Strait of Hormuz was supposed to be reopening. After months of conflict and severe disruption, a June agreement between the United States and Iran increased shipping traffic. In July, the US Energy Information Administration said it expected oil production and trade flows to move back towards pre conflict levels by the end of the year. Then, reality intervened. On Wednesday, only two vessels passed through the Strait of Hormuz according to shipping data reported by Reuters. Before the conflict, the normal daily figure was around 130 to 140 vessels. The latest fall followed renewed regional threats and claims of attacks on Saudi tankers. At the same time, a new proposal for managing passage through the strait has created another problem. Iran wants a much greater role in controlling traffic and has sought fees from ships using the route. Shipping and insurance sources say the proposed system may be practically unworkable because payments to an Iranian authority could breach sanctions and invalidate insurance cover. That tells us something important about Hormuz. The strait does not need to be completely closed to damage the world economy. It only needs to become dangerous, delayed, expensive, or legally uncertain. So, why is so much of the global energy system dependent on one narrow waterway? And after the events of 2026, who actually controls it? The Strait of Hormuz connects the Persian Gulf with the Gulf of Oman, and beyond that, the Arabian Sea. Iran lies on its northern side, Oman sits on the southern side of the passage, while the United Arab Emirates lies immediately beyond it. At its narrowest, the strait is roughly 21 miles wide. The actual shipping lanes used by large commercial vessels are much narrower, with organised inbound and outbound routes separated from one another. This is not an open ocean where tankers can simply spread out when tension rises. It is a confined maritime choke point beside states with rival security interests, military forces, and a long history of confrontation. A choke point is exactly what it sounds like. Trade from a very large region is squeezed through a very small route, and behind Hormuz sit several of the most important oil and gas exporters on Earth. Before the 2026 conflict, around 20 million barrels per day of petroleum liquids moved through Hormuz. That was roughly one fifth of global petroleum liquids consumption. The strait is also central to liquefied natural gas. Qatar sends much of its LNG exports through Hormuz, and around one fifth of global LNG trade used the route in 2024. Those percentages sound tidy, their consequences are not. Disruption affects crude heading to refineries in Asia, petroleum products moving between markets, and LNG cargoes supplying countries that cannot produce enough gas themselves. China, India, Japan, and South Korea are especially exposed because so much Gulf energy travels east. But Europe is affected too, even when a particular tanker was never heading anywhere near Europe. Oil and gas are traded internationally. Remove supply from one market and buyers compete harder for whatever remains. Energy markets are not famous for reacting to uncertainty with a calm cup of tea and a sensible committee meeting. They price risk quickly. The events of 2026 turned a theoretical vulnerability into a practical one. The conflict that began at the end of February effectively closed most normal commercial traffic through the strait for months. Gulf producers had to shut in huge amounts of production because oil could not simply leave the region at its usual pace. By June, the United States and Iran reached a memorandum intended to end the conflict and reopen Hormuz. Traffic increased. The Energy Information Administration responded by raising its expectations for global oil production and forecasting that trade flows could return close to pre conflict levels by the end of 2026. But reopening is not the same as normality. Traffic has remained thin and vulnerable to new threats. A shipping route can be technically open while owners, insurers, crews, and governments still treat it as dangerous. That is why one day of renewed tension can reduce traffic so dramatically. The physical channel may be there, confidence may not be. The obvious question is why tankers cannot take another route. The answer is that geography has already made most of that decision. Ports in Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Iraq, eastern Saudi Arabia, and much of the United Arab Emirates sit inside the Persian Gulf. A ship leaving those ports for the open ocean normally has to pass through Hormuz. There are important pipeline alternatives. Saudi Arabia can move some crude west towards the Red Sea. The United Arab Emirates has a pipeline to Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman outside Hormuz. Those routes matter. They provide resilience and emergency flexibility, but their capacity is limited. They cannot replace every barrel, every product cargo, and every LNG shipment that would normally move by sea. Pipelines also have terminals, maintenance requirements, and security risks of their own. Oil cannot be teleported from one coast to another, despite the occasional confidence with which television panels discuss the matter. Strategic reserves can be released. Production elsewhere can rise. Some cargoes can be redirected, but none of those responses is immediate, unlimited, or free. Iran's geography gives it enormous influence over the strait, but influence is not the same as effortless control. Iran can threaten shipping with naval forces, missiles, drones, mines, and fast attack craft. It does not need to sink every tanker or maintain a perfect blockade to create economic consequences. If war risk insurance rises, charter rates increase. If crews become harder to secure, journeys become more expensive. If companies fear sanctions, legal disputes, or attacks, they may delay a voyage even when the channel itself remains physically passable. A permanent closure would also carry costs for Iran. It risks military response, damages Iran's own commercial relationships, and disrupts regional trade on which Iran itself depends. The strongest leverage, therefore, comes from uncertainty. Iran does not have to prove that no ship can pass. It only has to make governments and companies ask whether passage will be safe, insured, and affordable. This is where the latest dispute becomes particularly interesting. Oman has been trying to find a regional arrangement that keeps traffic moving. Proposals discussed in recent weeks would give Iran and Oman a larger role in managing passage, while attempting to reassure Gulf states and international shipping. Iran has sought fees equivalent to roughly 5 to 7% of cargo value. Oman has considered a smaller charge of around 3%. On paper, that may look like a price for stability. In practice, shipping sources says it creates a legal maze. The Iranian authority involved is subject to United States sanctions. Paying it could expose companies to sanctions consequences. Lloyd's market clauses can also terminate insurance cover if a vessel pays prohibited fees. So a ship could face an absurd choice: pay to secure passage and risk losing legal or insurance protection, or refuse to pay and risk delaying the voyage. The International Maritime Organization has stressed the principle of free and non discriminatory transit through the strait. This is why controlling Hormuz is not as simple as placing a toll booth in the sea. The route sits at the intersection of geography, maritime law, sanctions, insurance, regional politics, and military power. Oman remains important because it can speak to actors who do not always speak comfortably to one another. But even good diplomacy cannot make those competing systems disappear. Oil prices are based not only on what is available today, but on what traders believe may be available tomorrow. Markets consider inventories, spare production capacity, shipping times, refinery demand, and political risk. When Hormuz looks unstable, the questions arrive immediately. How long could disruption last? How much can bypass the strait? Will producers elsewhere increase output? Will governments release reserves? Could military escalation damage production facilities as well as tankers? Nobody needs to know the final answer before prices move. The possibility of shortage is enough to create a risk premium. That is how an incident thousands of miles away can affect the replacement cost of fuel before the local petrol station has physically missed a single delivery. Britain does not receive all of its energy directly through one Gulf supply line, so the country is not physically dependent on Hormuz in the simplest sense. But global pricing means it cannot ignore the strait. If international crude prices rise, British refiners and fuel suppliers face higher replacement costs. Airlines, haulage companies, manufacturers, and shipping firms pay more. Those costs can feed into inflation. LNG disruption can also make European and Asian buyers compete harder for alternative cargoes, putting pressure on gas prices. The lesson is that geography does not need to be nearby to become expensive. A tanker hesitating at Hormuz can eventually matter to a household, a business, or a government budget in Britain. So, why does the Strait of Hormuz matter so much? Because geography has placed several major energy exporters behind one narrow maritime doorway, because pipelines can bypass only part of the traffic, because oil and LNG prices respond to fear as well as actual shortage, and because the 2026 crisis has shown that reopening the strait is not the same thing as restoring confidence in it. The latest argument over fees, sanctions, and insurance makes the central point even clearer. Hormuz does not need to be completely sealed to cause serious damage. It only needs to become uncertain. The modern economy can look digital, financial, and almost weightless. Underneath it are ships, ports, pipelines, and narrow channels of water. And sometimes the world economy is only as secure as the next tanker trying to pass through them. But Hormuz is not the only narrow stretch of water capable of shaking the global economy. A few thousand miles away, another choke point controls access between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, the Bab el-Mandeb. And when shipping there becomes dangerous, vessels can face a choice between risking the passage or taking the enormous detour around Africa. So, why does this relatively obscure stretch of water matter to everything from fuel prices to the cost of goods in British shops? That is where we are going next. This has been the Nelson Brief, the context behind the story.